some really dramatic moves coming from leadership in Canada yesterday. The big headline here is, of course, all in response to the Canadian trucker protest, which for a time had shut down some critical bridges, causing shutdowns at auto plants in Michigan. And of course, once they started messing with capitalism, then it got serious.
Well, especially U.S. capitalism.
Exactly, yeah. Then it got really serious. Biden puts in the phone call to Trudeau and everything changes. Yesterday, Trudeau went so far as to become the first Prime Minister of Canada to invoke the Emergency Act. This gives him sweeping, almost, I don't want to say martial law, but sweeping powers that the government normally does not hold, that the executive normally does not hold. Let's take a listen to that.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations.
Yeah, so this is a huge deal. And I did a lot of digging here, Saagar, about like what is the Emergencies Act and what was the predecessor act, because it's relatively new. That's why it was like implemented in the 80s. That's why this is the first time ever that a Canadian prime minister has invoked it. They actually considered invoking it for COVID, which would make more sense because, you know, in a pandemic,
way more of an emergency.
You've got, you know, hundreds of I don't know how many people died in Canada. A lot of people dying in Canada. Extreme risk to the population, of, you know, especially pre-vaccine, but even post-vaccine. And, you know, having some broader powers to be able to distribute the vaccine, you could understand more of a case for this. Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act here has met with significant pushback in Canada. You had one of the leaders of the provinces basically saying, we'll get to him in a minute, Doug Ford, saying that he's good with it. 3 other provinces saying, I don't like this direction whatsoever.
We have a tear sheet of that, actually.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we do have premiers of 3 Canadian provinces oppose Prime Minister Trudeau invoking emergency measures. One other one, Doug Ford, did say he's in favor of it. Some of the experts that were consulted, you know, Canadian scholars on these sorts of matters, expressed a lot of concern about this. They say to invoke a national emergency, the government would need to be saying that these protests threaten the security of Canada, our sovereignty, or our territorial integrity. So these are really quite extreme measures. That expert went on to say, I have real concerns about fudging the legal thresholds to invoke the most powerful federal law that we have. So this is being done in response to a protest that has been almost completely peaceful and has just, you know, it's caused disruption. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
But there have been few arrests. There have been some allegations of like property damage and those sorts of things. But to call in this sort of broad sweeping federal powers, the most extreme act that the federal government can take to deal with some protests, this is completely insane. And one other thing that I'll tell you from my research on this law, so the predecessor act was called the War Measures Act. And the last time it was used in peacetime was during what was called the October Crisis. And for those of you who don't know what that was when a high-level politician, Canadian politician, and a British diplomat were actually kidnapped by Quebec separatists. So this was an extraordinary situation. Wow. One of them was actually ultimately murdered. And that was the last time that anything similar to this was invoked. So like I said, they considered doing it for COVID, which of course was an extreme situation, and they said, no, this is too far. But for these protesters, now they're invoking the Emergencies Act. Really crazy stuff.
Yeah, and I just want to go into even more of the details on what they're allowed to do. This is CCP level madness. The Deputy Prime Minister said yesterday that banks can immediately freeze or suspend bank accounts without a court order and be protected from civil liability as long as they are connected to the trucker protests. They also are going to be seizing any funds directed towards the protests, including cryptocurrency, trying to go and ban any sort of monetary contributing to the protesters. In addition, what they have said, Krystal, is that if you are one of the protesters who's involved in this, they can not only seize and suspend your license forever, they can also even go and take money out of the owner of the truck's bank accounts. So we are looking at full-fledged financial warfare on the truckers. I don't think there's another way.
They can commandeer tow trucks to be. Part of the problem was that some of the tow truck operators weren't cooperating with them and refused to move the trucks. They can commandeer tow trucks. So this is quite extraordinary. We have a little bit of sound from Chrystia Freeland, who I was just telling you, actually knew her. She used to be a regular guest with Dylan Ratigan back like a decade ago. Yeah, and now she's been in Canadian leadership for quite some time. But in any case, she is announcing these incredibly disturbing and draconian new rules and regulations that the financial transactions will be subjected to and new powers claimed by the federal government. Let's take a listen to what she has to say.
Their relationships with anyone involved in the illegal blockades and report to the RCMP or CSIS. As of today, a bank or other financial service provider will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. In doing so, they will be protected against civil liability for actions taken in good faith. Federal government institutions will have a new broad authority to share relevant information with banks and other financial service providers.
So the saga with regards to this money just continues.
This is totally nuts.
Again, there's no indication that there's like nefarious anything to do with this money. Now, they don't like that a lot of it has come, frankly, from the U.S. But that's not illegal, and it's not, particularly nefarious. They've been using all this language about like foreign interference in Canadian affairs. But look, clearly there's significant, not majority, but some significant grassroots support for pushback against pandemic restrictions among the Canadian population. So it's funny to me the way that they've used this money, which there isn't a lot of transparency around. You can't go and look at exactly who's giving and what amounts, et cetera, et cetera. But they've sort of used this money to try to paint this picture that this is some shadowy, secretive thing that is happening. And again, if you got evidence of that, then bring it forward and we can all evaluate what's really going on. But there is no evidence. There's just sort of like insinuations and allegations based on the sheer amount of money that has come in to fund these protests.
Yeah, and the pretext and the language is just totally out of control. As you said, Krystal, they're repeating over and over again, this is not a peaceful protest, this is an occupation. I mean, they're honking their horns. Now, look, I think that's probably pretty annoying. If you live
there,
in the city of Ottawa,
gigantic
that's
pain in the ass.
And but as you said, you and I lived through a lot of different civil unrest here in Washington, D.C. It wasn't exactly fun to live around, but that's part of what living in a liberal, free, open society is. I'm reminded often of, there's that clip from the Newsroom, terrible show, but there was a clip that went viral back in the 2010s where the host was like, many other countries have freedom. What are you talking about? And I'm reminded in these moments that it's not really true. I mean, you have here the Canadian Prime Minister, who is our neighbor to the north, invoking the Emergency Act, declaring full-scale financial warfare on his own citizens, suspending civil liberties. I mean, that's crazy town. I don't even know, in the history of the United States, it's one of the most rare things to ever have done that. I think maybe Lincoln in the Civil War. And this is being done in order to stop truckers protesting in the capital city in a supposedly free, liberal, and open society? No, that's not freedom. Like, if you can seize the bank accounts and just simply go after them with no recourse in the Canadian judicial system, you don't live in a free country. That's very clearly what's happening here.
I don't know if I gotta think that one through because, we saw some really aggressive actions taken by the federal government here during the George Floyd protests. We saw what happened with the peaceful protesters in the square by the White House. We saw the way that, federal operatives were sent to like infiltrate the protests.
Yeah, but those people could raise $60 million,
that were
right?
in Portland. Sure,
Yeah.
they did. And by the way,
Yeah.
we should do a segment
Yeah.
on the fact that no one knows what's going
Yeah.
on with that money, and it is shady as hell, and no one basically wants to touch it.
And they have a constitutional right, though. And,
Yeah.
what I'm pointing to is our Constitution, I'm not saying it's perfect,
Yeah.
but we're a lot more free than the Canadians, and I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're about to cover for this weekend how the CIA has some of their like secret data collection programs. So we don't overtly come out and say we're going to suspend all civil liberties, but I also wouldn't say that our civil liberties have exactly been
There's
protected.
there is no
we can
saying,
save that debate for another day.
No saying that it's not perfect, but come and take it is a meme for a reason.
We
That's
do
all I'll
want to point out, though, listen, these protests have had an
They're
impact.
working. Yeah.
There are a number of Canadian provinces now that have rolled back some of their pandemic protections. Let's take a listen to Ontario Premier Doug Ford talking about rolling back pandemic restrictions, but also how he is on board and the actions he is taking to further crack down on protesters. And as I mentioned before, he is one of the premiers who supports the enactment of the Emergencies Act. Let's take a listen to Premier Doug Ford.
Because of this progress, we heard from our Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Moore, 2 weeks ago, and again last week, that we were fast approaching a time when we could safely remove restrictions. Over the weekend, I received recommendations from Dr. Moore on a plan to safely reopen our economy and remove Ontario's vaccine passport system. I've accepted these recommendations, and so today I can announce that beginning on February 17th, we will remove all capacity limits except for sporting events, concert venues, and theaters, which will be capped at 50%. Those who are still there, to those of you who are there with the sole objective of causing disruption and chaos, there'll be serious consequences for this lawless activity. We will continue to raise the consequences against those who are holding millions of jobs and people hostage. A number of personal vehicles were seized over the weekend, and those seizures will continue. Let me be clear. If you choose to use your vehicle to create chaos, you will lose that vehicle and your license, plain and simple.
So that's the dual message there, Krystal, which we did find very interesting, which is on the one hand, they're like, okay, we hear you. No more vaccine passports, which is kind of interesting. It's even happening here in the city of Washington, D.C. Our mayor removing the vaccine passport system after a month. Thank you for destroying some businesses that refused to comply in the interim. And cases are actually worse now. So seems like the polling has changed. Yeah. But that's really what goes to show you what's happening in Canada. They're trying to have the dual approach of, we hear you. Basically, I think what they're trying to do is placate any of the domestic political sympathy with the protesters and then try and remove the protesters through extremely forcible means at the same time.
Yeah, it all changed on a dime
Right.
once they started messing with the U.S.'s capitalism. I mean,
funny.
that really is the flip right there. Before that, they really were just kind of, there were some actions being taken, but mostly they were just kind of letting them do their thing. Mm-hmm. And then once auto plants started to have to shut down because the bridge traffic was closed, Biden makes his call. Then all of a sudden you see both all right, fine, we're going to give on some of the pandemic, we're going to throw you all a bone. We're going to give in on some of these pandemic restrictions, which, that poses giving in on the pandemic restrictions. In fact, that's something that business community really wants. So it doesn't pose any sort of threat to, capital. So that's easy enough to do. And then on the other hand, we're going to crack down on these protesters. I haven't seen polling. I'd be curious to know what the Canadian public thinks about the sort of more aggressive tactics towards protesters. I wouldn't be surprised if there's fairly decent support.
If I had to guess,
to get this thing under control and get them off the streets and arrest them and do whatever it takes to get them out of there.
We've seen that in Europe, Krystal. I would put the Canadians much more analogous to like the Europeans. They actually largely support a lot of these measures. Sadly, I mean, but look, it's their country. You can do whatever you want. But from what I can see in Germany and in the UK, France, there are some protests, but the vast majority of the public seems to either be okay or support these types of aggressive measures. Like I said, look, the West, we have some similarities, but we're very, very, very different people. And even our neighbors to the north, I don't know. I would guess, based upon public polling, that they probably support it. You know, even vaccine passports and all that were very broadly popular up there.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think, again, zooming out for the relevance for the American public, I think the actions of GoFundMe and the awareness of the ability of these tech platforms to just pick and choose which causes they support, that's, you know, obviously a problem that would afflict us as well. So that's incredibly significant. The fact that there was a global spread to other countries of these type of protests. And then something I'm going to be talking about in my monologue is the left could learn something from the tactics that were employed, but also kind of the limits of what this protest was ultimately all about and why it was so easy for officials to ultimately cave to it in some respects and basically give them what they want.
Yeah,
so
I think that's right.
very interesting story that we will continue to follow and see what happens next. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.